This is Block 8, Pax Americana, Section 5, Eisenhower's Cold War, with the section beginning with Sputnik. It's a strange thing that the United States alternately believed that the Soviet Union was 3 days away from taking over the world, and then other days believed that the Soviet Union couldn't do anything right because they were so incompetent at everything. It was a mental block that was never really resolved. It's like blaming Jews for being communists and at the same time blaming Jews for being masters of international finance. The Soviets were just, they were bad any way that Americans wished to look at them, or most Americans at least. In 1957, though, in October, Americans looked up at the sky and saw something that terrified them. Going around the Earth once every 90 minutes was a 200-pound artificial satellite put up into space by the Soviet Union that was called Sputnik. It was the first man-made object ever to be in space. And as Americans stood in their back, and you could see it from your backyard passing overhead real fast through the night sky, as Americans stood there in their backyard and watched this thing fly over their houses, every single one of them knew that if the Soviets could put, a rocket into orbit over their heads, what would stop them from putting a rocket in orbit over their heads with a nuclear bomb attached to it? The Soviets followed up that first success a month later by launching a 1,000-pound satellite into space, carrying a living cargo, a dog named Laika. This shook American confidence deeply, that Americans truly believed that the United States was leaps and bounds ahead of the Soviet Union in this sorts of thing. And it made it seem as if the Soviet Union was much further ahead than the United States. It seemed to many Americans that American science and math and engineering were suddenly falling behind the Soviet Union. And like I said, if a Soviet satellite could pass overhead, they could certainly launch intercontinental ballistic missiles to do the same thing. In this atmosphere of national panic, there are calls made for the United States to improve its science and math education, to modernize the American school, to make the American school more responsive to the modern technological needs of math and science and engineering. And that was done. President Eisenhower passed the National Defense and Education Act in 1958, authorizing $1 billion in federal money to loans for needy college students and to grants to K-12 schools who would use those grants to improve their math and science education. If you want to see a great movie about this time, October Skies is a great movie about a group of kids in Pennsylvania who see Sputnik pass overhead and are inspired to build their own rocket. These kids, these like 12, 14-year-old high school, kids start building their own rockets on the coal fields of western Pennsylvania, and eventually they all become NASA rocket engineers. It's really kind of a neat story. It's a good movie. Rocket fever swept the nation. There was movies about rockets, cartoons about rockets, the Jetsons, all of a sudden rockets and space are on everybody's mind. And following up on this, President Eisenhower established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which of course is known as NASA. And it was going to be NASA's job to develop two things. That NASA was tasked with developing missiles for military use and developing space flight for various uses, some military and some civilian. The United States is not as far behind the Soviet Union as people are afraid. A year later, in 1958, the United States launches its own satellite, and now with the United States galvanized into action, the United States space program is soon catching up with the Soviet Union. We have to understand something about the difference between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was a complete, massive national effort for the Soviets to put this satellite, Sputnik, into space before the Americans did. And they did it before the Americans did because the Americans weren't really working on it that hard. Once the Americans got freaked out into action and started actually focusing on this. We caught up with the Soviets very, very quickly, and in the 1960s would pass them. But by the late 1950s, what came to be called the space race was on in full force.